Hey guys, Slater Magic here, and very recently a new card from Amonkhet was spoiled. I've been watching more stuff come out, and nothing screams utterly broken except for the 4/4 lifelinker for 2. I think that's a little much. Oh, especially since it's unplayable unless you also have Always Watching, which obviously people would put in that deck. So mono white's going to be insane. Red, white, blue is going to be insane. Regular white, blue is going to be insane. It's, oh my god, I'm not looking forward to this at all. But in keeping with their tradition, Wizards has printed one of the dumbest cards I've ever seen. I feel like this card would go straight onto Wedge's worst cards ever printed list, because some of them on there are so confusing, you can't even tell what they do. Like, well, I have an example, but I'll save it for the end of the video, because it's worse. It's a lot worse than this. I'm sure you know which one I'm talking about by now. Bounty of the Luxa. Green plus blue plus 2, it's an enchantment. It's a rare, must be good, right? Well, hard to tell. At the beginning of your next pre-combat main phase, remove all flood counters from Bounty of the Luxa. If no counters were removed this way, put a flood counter on Bounty of the Luxa and draw a card. Otherwise, add 1 colorless, 1 green, and 1 blue to your mana pool. You almost have to read this backwards to, like, reverse engineer what the hell this card does. I mean, it was plain as day to me within 5 seconds. Every other turn do this, and every other turn do this. They couldn't have printed it that way because it's too unspecific, though. Let's start with, okay, at the beginning of your next pre-combat main phase. Well, they would have said upkeep, but people, if it generates 3 mana, people tend to use that during their main phase, like to summon a creature. You can't do that during your upkeep. So that's why they moved it from, you know, at the beginning of your upkeep, which is how almost every card is phrased, to the beginning of your next pre-combat main phase. Now, what... Oh, God, this is where the stupid comes in. No matter when you try to activate this triggered ability, it will never be the next pre-combat main phase. It will always be the current pre-combat main phase. So you'd almost have to say the trigger goes off during your upkeep, and you'd have to declare it then. Okay, I'm triggering this during my upkeep. Now, it's like a delayed result trigger, which isn't even a thing in Magic. At the beginning of your next pre-combat main phase, well, actually, come to think of it, I think there are delayed triggers on some cards. It's really rare, but I could have sworn I've seen it. So as far as I know, that's the way you'd have to actually say it, because if you try to say, okay, trigger on this enchantment trigger, well, sorry, but at the beginning of your next pre-combat main phase, not the one that you're in right now, the next one. I am not joking, I'm not nitpicking, I actually think that's how it's going to have to be played, completely straight-face serious. So anyway, when it finally becomes your next pre-combat main phase, remove all flood counters from Bounty of the Luxa. Here's the problem. If an effect says discard a card, then even if you have no cards in hand, you still do it. Like, you sort of fail to do it, but it still happens. Like, if I target my opponent with Thoughtseize and they have 0 cards in hand, I can still technically cast the spell. You know, it's targeting, and it's targeting the opponent, and I choose which opponent it targets, but the spell doesn't fail to cast just because they have no cards in hand. The same thing goes for, target player sacrifices a creature. Just because they have no creatures doesn't mean that they don't go through the process of sacrificing a creature, and then one of the sub-rules about that is if you don't have one, then you don't do it. So, even if you don't have any flood counters on Bounty of the Luxa, you would still be considered to be removing it, successfully removing it. Here's an example that's an exact, precise parallel, although the rules, interpretations, and different mechanics are completely different. If you cast at least 1 spell this turn, then do this. Okay, there's a couple cards that say that. If you tried to summon a creature, okay, that you're casting a creature spell, and then it was countered by your opponent, you still qualify. You qualify for that state-based test or whatever they call it. So if you attempted to, but then failed to successfully cast a spell, you would still qualify for the if you cast 1 or more spells this turn qualifier. So that's a problem for this card, because I'm pretty sure the same rule would apply, unless it's written specifically differently. If no counters were removed this way, Okay, there we have a contradiction. Put a flood counter on Bounty of the Luxa and draw a card. So, yes, no counters were removed, but the action of removing counters was taken, even if there weren't any counters on it. So it depends on the interpretation. It's very clear what they meant to say with this card, and I think I know what the judge ruling will be. So expect to see a card ruling or 2 or 7 or 20 about this card. It's the same thing. It's, oh, did you successfully remove a counter? Well, I mean, no counters were removed, but you did, quote, remove a counter as like an action verb. You did successfully complete that action. Just like, did you cast a spell? Well, I tried. It wasn't successful and it didn't successfully cast, but I tried to cast it. I tried to discard a card. I tried to sacrifice a creature. And I think those might be worded differently, but this is still deeply confusing. So then it just says otherwise, which I don't think in English you can start a sentence with that word. It's like starting a sentence with and. You can't do it. So otherwise, with a needless period before it instead of a comma, add 1 colorless, 1 green, 1 blue to your mana pool. So the first turn that this goes off, you would place a flood counter on it, draw a card, and that's it. Then the next turn it would trigger, you would remove the flood counter from it, and then add 3 mana to your mana pool of the specified colors, and that's it. And then theoretically, you'd, be able to cast the card you drew last turn. That's kind of the theory of this card, obviously. So clearly a very good, beneficial, nice card to put out. I mean, it doesn't help anything. It doesn't trigger with anything. It just helps accelerate the game and helps you do a little bit better. Maybe helps you, draw cards, get a combo to go off. But it by itself does not directly trigger anything. I mean, unless there's something that says every time you cast an enchantment, blah, or for every permanent on the field that's 1 color, but I don't remember anything like that. So this card is just idiotic. I mean, for somebody who's been playing as long as me and I'm good with patterns and recognizing logic and crap, I get it. I got it right away. I'm completely exaggerating, making too much of this. But this is an example of a card so stupidly complicated that, like, to the average to lesser, established Magic players, I guess you'd say, the less experienced people, it might just confuse them to the point where they either misplay it or just avoid playing with it because it's just too weird. Now, things get even weirder when you use one of the 2 cards, might even be 3 right now, that can manipulate the number of unique counters of any kind on a permanent and duplicate them. Oh, and I have to throw this in because I know somebody will say it. It's non-legendary, so if you get 2 out, well, the card refers to itself by name, which means this exact instance of this permanent. So people have already totally turned this into a meme and a complete joke on Twitter, so yeah. So as promised, here's a card that's worse. Chains of Mephistopheles. If a player would draw a card except the first one he or she draws in his or her draw step each turn, that player discards a card instead. If the player discards a card this way, he or she draws a card. If the player doesn't discard a card this way, he or she puts the top card of his or her library into his or her graveyard. What the actual hell does this card do? As far as I can tell, it says, okay, if a player would draw a card except for the first one he or she draws in his or her draw step each turn. So you can get away scot-free with your first card drawn on the turn during your draw phase. You still get that. It cannot be interrupted. For any other card that they draw during the turn, like with like a draw spell, like divination or whatever, that player discards a card instead. So instead of drawing a card, they have to ditch a card. Then, if the player discards a card this way, he or she draws a card anyway. Why? Now, I still get it. Okay, so what it could have said is every time a player draws more than 1 card in a given turn cumulatively or something like that, they have to first discard a card, then they can draw a card like normal. What I don't get is the next part. If the player doesn't discard a card this way, when would that ever happen? He or she puts the top card of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So what I'm guessing they're saying is if you attempt to... Oh, boy. Okay, let's put together a scenario. You have 0 cards in hand, and then you draw a card, and then you immediately cast it during your first main phase. Then you go to combat, okay, whatever. Go to the second main phase. You cast... Wait, no. How would you get another spell? Okay, a creature in combat says when it dies, you draw a card. So the creature dies. Okay, oh, wait a minute. You're drawing a card other than the first card you drew this turn. So instead, you have to discard a card. But if you didn't discard a card successfully this way, then instead of the first trigger, which is discard a card, then draw a card, you have to not draw a card, and then you have to put the top card from your library into your graveyard instead. So actually a pretty situational card, but like really powerful, especially for 2 in black. That's not bad. The problem is you're going to spend 5 minutes figuring out what the hell this card does, means, or says. Now, it did take me like, God, I'd say 2 or 3 minutes to figure out what the hell this card actually does the first time I saw it. Lucky for us, in 2004, they came out with some rulings, and then they came out with 3 more rulings in 2007. Oh God, I can't wait to read these. I have not read them yet. Let's read them together. The effect is cumulative. If there are 2 of these on the battlefield, each... Oh God, I can't even imagine what hell this would be. What the hell would you do if there's 2 of these out? Flip the table, quit the game, and slap your opponent. Okay, that's what I expect this ruling to say. It says, each of them will modify each draw after the first one if during the draw step, and will cause the player to discard or to, quote, mill a card from their library. As they resolve in order, the player must discard if possible. Once the player fails the discard and instead mills a card, all further effects of additional chains of Mephistopheles will not do anything. This is because the mill also replaces the draw effect, and the player is no longer drawing a card. As far as I know, that's not how it works. The triggers would simultaneously stack on the... Oh, well, I suppose it's a conditional trigger. So then you would recheck it at resolution time. Yeah, they are right. You handle them in order. Each one makes you discard first and then continue, or else mill a card and lose the draw. Well, that's a way frickin' simpler way of setting it. That last 2 sentences, they should have just said it that way. What the hell? Next ruling. Cards which are drawn as a cost are affected by this card because replacement effects can alter the payment of costs. How would drawing a card be part of a cost? I don't know. I can't think of any examples, but that would be a pretty cool card. Next up, fast forwarding to 2007, where they had to revise this even further. If a spell or ability would cause a player to draw multiple cards, this is treated as a number of individual draw 1 card actions. Oh, I didn't know that, actually. I thought it was quite the opposite. Apply the effect of Chains of Mephistopheles to each one. Oh, no, actually, I didn't. I am familiar with that rule because of a card that I looked up a while ago. Next up, a player's normal card draw on his or her turn is exempt from this effect. All other draws will be affected. I could have sworn they said something different in the first one, but whatever. The final ruling is, here's what happens. Oh my God. Did they seriously just start a ruling with, here's what happens? Oh, I feel like I'm going to like this one. And I told you guys, I haven't read this yet. I'm reading this right along with you. Here's what happens when Chains of whatever replaces a player's draw. If that player has at least 1 card in his or her hand, he or she discards a card and then draws a card. Thought that was obvious. Well, it's not that obvious, but if that player's hand is empty, he or she puts the top card of his or her library into his or her graveyard. The player doesn't draw a card at all. That is not even a ruling. It's literally just explaining what the hell this card does. It took them until 2007, specifically September 16th, 2007, according to this, to explain what a card from freaking Legends actually does. They had to make a ruling just stating, here's how this piece of crap works. Stop calling the judges over. That is unbelievably hilarious to me. This could not have been worded worse, and there's really only 1 card that I think beats it. I would tell you what it is right now, but I don't remember the name of it. It's a white card that has to do with blocking assignments. It is the worst thing I've ever seen, ever. Oh, and it's like Wedge's favorite card ever, so you should definitely find a picture of it and tweet it at him. So hopefully you guys love this wonderful walk through the awesome world of MTG card design and its utter failures. I'll see you guys next video.